Watching Cairo TV, Channel 7, your 24-hour news source.
Thank you, Aaron. Well, he's a modern-day Charles Lindbergh, we've said, and tonight this pilot's round-the-world journey is all but over. Tom Casey left Seattle 7 months ago to try something never done before. He wanted to fly his tiny, and we mean tiny, float plane around the globe. And tonight, Tom is back in Western Washington. Wayne Garcia talked with him just moments ago and has this story.
Yeah, quite a story it is. You know, Tom is spending the night in Friday Harbor up in the San Juan Islands. Just a few minutes ago, we got some video of Tom and his airplane thanks to home photographer Bill Giese. It has been an incredible journey for Casey. He had to crash land his plane in the icy North Pacific in Saudi Arabia. He had to be hospitalized nearly a month for back surgery. Casey had to pay $10,000 just to be allowed to leave India. All in all, it was a 27,000-mile trip that passed through Japan, the Soviet coast, and other places. We talked with him just a couple of minutes ago and got some reaction.
Around the world. People are great everywhere. You know, if it wasn't for the people, the whole trip would have been a total waste today. It's the people I've met, the different countries, how they accepted it. The first time most of the people had ever seen a float plane.
Tom's trip began last May on Seattle's Lake Washington, and things went wrong almost from the start. He planned to head west to the Soviet Union, but couldn't get clearance, so he had to come back and go the other way. But that's all behind him, and there's some good memories, too. He went through Thailand and was greeted by 300 children with signs that said, "You can do it, Uncle Tom." Casey plans on flying the final leg of his journey tomorrow morning, which should have him touching down on Lake Washington at about 10 a.m. What a story.
It is a story, and we're proud that he was able to finish. Of course, there were so many mishaps along the way. The back surgery, probably the greatest setback of all.
Yes, that set him back about a month, and he says he did it all for Seattle. And if you're wondering if there's a book in the offing, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, when you say he did it for Seattle, he was planning on being back in time for the Goodwill Games.
Didn't quite make it, no.
Bring publicity to you.
Thanks, Wayne.
Yes.
And that's the Cairo 6:30 news for tonight. Thank you for watching.
Have a good night, everybody.
Well, better late than never for floatplane pilot Tom Casey. You may remember the start of his trip around the world that began last May. He was supposed to complete his 27,000-mile journey in time for the Goodwill Games, but he didn't. Illness, travel restrictions, and plane problems kept Casey from reaching that goal, but his mission is now just about complete. Casey is scheduled to land tomorrow morning at Sandpoint on Lake Washington, and he hopes his journey, despite its many problems, will be an inspiration to others.
Looking for a unique one of the great adventures, or perhaps misadventures, of this year will end tomorrow morning on Lake Washington. A float plane pilot, Tom Casey, plans to land on Lake Union and then Lake Washington, ending a 7-month round-the-world flight. Casey flew into Friday Harbor today. Bill Giese captured this on his home video camera. Casey had more than just a little trouble on this trip. He crash-landed in the North Pacific. He spent a month in Saudi Arabia having back surgery, and that's just the highlights, or would they be the lowlights? But he says none of that matters now because he's home. Casey plans to arrive on Lake Union to officially end his trip around 10 in the morning, a trip that was supposed to end when the Goodwill Games began. Better late than never. Better late than never. We're out of here. We'll see you tomorrow.
Pilot Tom Casey circles overhead, a victory lap.
It's just good to be home in this beautiful Seattle weather. You know, it's been a long while.
He comes home to a hero's welcome.
Welcome home, Tom!
And a son's embrace.
It's my old man. He did good, didn't he? See them stickers? All right.
A sticker for every country Casey landed in. 20 badges of courage. You'll remember Casey got off to a rocky start in May.
Stop the rudder!
He's still out of here.
But this turned out to be the least of his troubles. He flew up to Anchorage and was stalled nearly a month. The Soviets refused him clearance. So Casey turned around, flew back through Seattle, and headed the other direction. He had no major problem until Saudi Arabia. No, not the crisis with Kuwait. Casey had a crisis with his back and needed surgery. But even that didn't stop him. After surgery, Casey encountered one of the high points of his trip in Thailand. He said hundreds of children greeted him with a sign that said, "Welcome to Thailand, Uncle Tom. You can do it."
Just the total enjoyment, the people I met around the world, the different cultures. Every place I went to was a new reward.
But then came the low point, a crash landing in the frigid ocean off the Aleutian Islands. Casey thought it was all over.
When I realized the plane was still upright and everything else, and I was bobbing out there, and they rescued me on the plane, I had a new life all of a sudden. So it was like starting a whole new trip.
Casey says luck played the biggest part in getting him home. But those who welcomed him home know it was much more than that. They say it took Casey's exceptional will and guts. Josephine Chang, Como News 4.
Even with corporate sponsorship, Casey says the trip still cost him more than $300,000.
Stick with us throughout the evening. We'll be keeping an eye on all of it.
It was a snowy welcome today for an Everett pilot who did what many people said he couldn't do. He circled the globe in a small seaplane. After nearly 7 months and 27,000 miles, Tom Casey claimed success and a page in aviation history books. Barbara Matt was among the crowd to welcome him home.
The Liberty II landed in the history books today. Few believed the float plane and its pilot would make it around the world, but they did.
So how do you feel?
You gonna do it again?
Speechless. No. Once enough.
Once around the world took Tom Casey nearly 7 months, cost him as much as $500,000, laid him up for weeks in a Saudi hospital with major back surgery, and at the lowest point found him stranded and depressed off the Aleutian Islands. When Casey left Seattle last May, he knew he'd have to push it. What he didn't know is that he'd actually have to use the emergency locator he took with him, or have to face so much red tape. He also didn't know he'd get such a warm greeting around the world. And through it all, he learned a lot about himself.
I found out I had patience I never believed I had before. You know, waiting and everything else. And I became a diplomat in a lot of different ways.
The Liberty II will now go to a museum for the time being. As for its pilot, Tom Casey, well, he plans to keep his feet on the ground, sort of. He wants to go skiing for a couple of weeks. In Seattle, Barbara Matt, Cairo News.
Casey took off and landed more than 75 times on the water and visited 20 countries during his trip.
5-day forecast from Harry.
Chris, Tom Casey has just finished an adventure of a lifetime. Tuesday morning, he set his float plane down in Seattle after a round-the-world trip that was plagued with some troubles, had some woes, mechanical failures, a few health problems, a couple of logistical nightmares, and throw in a storm or two. But Tom Casey finished the trip. Now what's he going to do? Is he going to go to Disneyland? No, he's going to be on the noon news first, and here he is right here. Tom Casey, welcome home.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
It's great to be back.
We've been talking so much about the weather. This weather must be just absolutely nothing for you, considering what you've been through out there on a 27,000-mile trip around the world.
Oh, I've seen a lot of weather very similar to this, and I actually rode ahead of the weather and behind it using it as a buffer for clear weather, and it helped me a lot with the winds.
There are a lot of folks out there, and there are two guys probably sitting right here, curious as to why one would want to fly a float plane around the world.
Well, I think we've all wanted to do something nobody else has ever done, and I had an opportunity in the history of aviation to be the first. And it inspired me because in Seattle, leaving from Seattle at Sandpoint was the first around-the-world flight ever in 1924. And they went halfway on floats and halfway on wheels, and they were sponsored by Congress and the Senate and everything else, and used 35 engines and start out with 5 airplanes, finished with 2. And I just saw a window there that I thought would be great, interesting, and I went for it.
We, of course, here in the Northwest, with the aviation industry here, we've seen the 747s, the fly around the world and all that. This is something completely different. I don't think folks out there really have a sense of what it must have been like in a small plane, the danger involved, just the logistical nightmare of trying to get around the world in a small plane.
I'm glad you mentioned Boeing there, because I think half the place in the world thought I was a 747 with floats. In Saudi Arabia, there was one time where they put the PT boats outside 3 miles out at sea and wanted me to land between 4 PT boats because they misinterpreted the distance I needed to land for depth. They thought I needed 50 meters of depth to land. So it was quite interesting when they found out that it was basically a 20-foot airplane. And, even in Karachi, Pakistan, they thought it was an omen coming out of the sky. These people have never ever seen us before. There were an awful lot of difficulties in the flight, though, that will be passed on.
I was going to say, just politically dealing with countries out there, some of whom not necessarily friendly, some of whom I would expect maybe don't care that you're trying to do something that nobody else has done.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Most of them really didn't care, and it's very, very easy for people throughout the world to say no at something. because there's very few positive people in positions that could make life easy for people. It's easier for them to say no, and it happened in Greece. Greece was great, but 28 days to get into Egypt just to get fuel. And the embassies just went on vacation for 14 weeks, and they believe in mailing letters to get your clearance. So when they got back, it went another 14 days. And I would have to say 2.5 months of the delay was strictly only to get into 2 countries. India was a total disaster and nightmare. Then the other delay was 1.5 months for surgery on my back, and then another month to put an engine in Alaska. So it's still only a 1.5 month flight. It just took me a long time.
Did you think at some point, and obviously it would be expected that you would, think about just quitting, saying, forget it, let's call it quits?
No. When you have people like Phillips 66 who really stood behind me in the Middle East and third world countries, Jack Hammond and Bill Coleman, they were on the phone 24 hours a day getting me the clearance through the Middle East. And when you have the support that I had like that, everything that was worked out together by a team, and there were probably hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, that are responsible for doing it. And you can't say no to people like that. You just have to keep going.
Final question. A good friend of mine is a man who did something very similar to you. Mark Schrader is a guy who sailed single-handedly around the world in a sailboat by himself. I asked him after he came back, I said, would you ever conceive of doing anything like this again? He said no. 1 year later, he did it again.
That's right.
Would you ever do something like this again, Tom?
I probably have the exact same feeling he has. I think now that I've overcome all the obstacles, there's a great challenge in doing it. I wouldn't mind breaking my own record at it someday, but I doubt if I ever will.
Why don't you just kind of relax a little bit, enjoy a Seahawk game, and the beautiful weather that we have going on out here?
It looks great. I've been in the snow ski business my whole life here in Seattle, and I'm looking to go to Sun Valley or Park City for the holidays, so I'll enjoy it.
Enjoy yourself and welcome home. Have a happy holidays.
Thank you very much.
Nice
it's great
to meet
being
you.
here, and I want to thank everybody in Seattle for the welcome they gave me when I came back.
Well, it was fun having you back. Thanks.
I forgot the most important question. Did he ever lose his luggage?
Never know. We're going to have the latest on storm-related closures next, and maybe I'll answer that question for you. I think we already did answer it, as a matter of fact. Then a big change in the Soviet Union. Why did it happen? What does it mean? Our Lou Guzzo tries to sort things out next.
CNN Headline News, I'm Bob Lozier sitting in for Lynn Russell. Tom Casey is now the first person to circle the globe alone in a seaplane. He landed today in the same Seattle lake he took off from 188 days ago. The trip took 5 months longer than planned. Casey was grounded in Saudi Arabia for 6 weeks by a back injury and for a month by Egypt's refusal to grant landing rights. He says obtaining that permission was his biggest difficulty.
It's nice to let the rest of the world know what float planes are capable of doing and what you can do. And unfortunately, every place I had to land, they thought it was a 747 on floats, and they wanted me to land out in the ocean. So rivers and lakes were scarce, and I'd fly over them and say, that's where I want to go, but I couldn't because it was, the clearances. I had to go through the Navy, the Coast Guard, everybody.
Casey also survived an emergency landing in frigid ocean waters near Alaska.
This is the CNN Evening News, live around the world, with Patrick Emery and Lou Waters substituting for Donna Kelly.
And sleet and slush become the welcome home confetti for Tom Casey. He is the first person to fly a seaplane solo around the world. During his trip, he touched down only on oceans, rivers, and lakes. The journey took 188 days, 5 months longer than he had planned. He had engine trouble, hurt his back, and had to wait a month to get permission just to land in Egypt. And that's it for this edition of the Evening News. Have a good evening. I'm Patrick Emery.
I'm Lou Waters. Take care.
Dissolve. Hit your card. They want to copyright it. Copyright it. Roll break, man. Fade to black.